Hey, in this lesson, we're going to start creating the list project, and the project that we're working on is going to be a list coming from JSON data, and it's going to output the contents of the JSON data onto the page within the web page and give us the opportunity to interact with it with JavaScript. And as we're connecting to the data, it's got some property names and values here. So we've got a name for the user and the guests and also the status. So depending on what the status is, we're going to add a different class to it. So it's going to be red if it's false and green with an underline if it's true. So you can go ahead and create your own version of this project making use of the JSON data. So let's create our list project that we're going to be doing in this lesson. I've created a new app4.js file, so we've already linked to that. And this is the app4.js file where we can create the JSON data and then output that onto the page. And we're also going to make an interactive list within this lesson. So let's create a new file, and within the new file, create and save this as JSON list. So we can just call it list JSON. And this is going to be sitting within the same directory as the index app4.js and list JSON. So within here, let's create our first list. So creating an array, and within the array, let's structure a few objects. So we're going to have a list for a party, and we're going to have a bunch of names that we're going to loop through and iterate through. So the first one is going to be John, and then the second one is going to be the number of guests that John is bringing. So this is going to be a number value. So let's put it in for 5. And then lastly, let's do a Boolean value for status. So whether they've confirmed or not that they are coming. So false. And we'll keep this structure for all of the items within this list so that we can easily loop through it. And that's one of the most important things when you are constructing your JSON data and your JSON object, to make sure that the structure of the list is going to be consistent and that you can easily iterate through the content. So next up, let's add in some more people, and you can copy and paste and use the first structure as the template, and then just update the values that you want to use for the name, for the guests, and also we'll just keep that one at false, comma separated out. And as you're constructing this JSON object, you can add in as many names and as many of these objects as you want. And let's do one more here. And we'll keep this one at true. So that one's true and confirmed. So now we've got our JSON object. And next up, we want to bring this into the JavaScript. So making a selection with our JavaScript. So we already do have a few places where we can output some content. And then we can also, as the DOM content loads, then we can make use of the output element and populate some data. So using the document and query selector, selecting the element with a class of output. And if you console log out your selection of the element, it should log that element into the console, and you should be able to hover over it and highlight it on the page. Also, let's add in some content. So you can do text content and add some content. And just to make sure that everything is working. So this is where we're going to output the list contents on the page. And we need to connect to the JSON data. So there is a function within JavaScript that you can listen for the DOM content loaded. So this is an event that you can set to trigger. And once the event triggers, then we know that the DOM content has loaded and we're ready to interact with the web page content. So set up a window and add an event listener. The event that we're listening for is going to be the DOM content loaded event. So this is an event that fires when the initial HTML document has been completely loaded and parsed without waiting for style sheets, images, subframes to finish loading. So basically, if you are familiar with jQuery, this is the same thing as document ready, and it just indicates that the browser has finished loading all of the page elements, and that allows the JavaScript to know that we're ready to start interacting with the content. They have an example here, window add event listener, and the event that it's listing for is the DOM content loaded. So whenever it fires off, then it's going to run this code. So we can also copy and paste it and then just make sure that it is working. I'm also going to update the view to have the word wrap so that we can see the page content. And now whenever we save it, we see that DOM fully loaded and parsed. So that means that we've got the DOM content is loaded and ready to go. So at this point, we can make our fetch request, and making the fetch request to get the content that we want to load onto the page. So creating the list structure and the interaction for the user, and we're going to make a connection to the list.json file. So we can use the format that we saw in the last lesson where we were making the fetch request with JSON to the JSON file. So fetch and fetching to whatever the URL is. And I usually do like to keep the URL dynamic, so that will keep it and make it easy if we do need to update it. So currently it's located at list.json, and if I do have a web URL or if I go live and I want to have data that I can update in a JSON file, then I can just update this web URL. And I'll show you how to do that as well. So setting it up as URL and listening for the promise, and then when it does get the response, doing a return on the response object and returning it as JSON. So using the built-in method to return the content as JSON. And then the next promise is going to be where we get the data back. And once we get the data back, you can also wrap it within another bracket if you want. So depending on how you want to output the content. So loading and getting the data out. And I'll just fix up the brackets there. So once we have the data, first off, let's just make sure that we did get the data. So log it out into the console. And the way that it gets logged out, so this data value variable is going to be an array, as we've got in a length. And with arrays, we know that it's really easy to loop through the arrays. So let's loop through the data object, and using for each, we'll loop through the array, returning back the element, and we'll console log out each one of the elements on the page. So that breaks apart each one of the items that is contained within the JSON file. So doing it this way makes it really easy to work with the content. Now, in order to add it to the page, I'm going to create a separate function that's going to handle that. So let's set up a function, and I'll just make the list. It's actually going to be making the list item and give it an attribute, an argument name of item, and I'll move up the code. So the idea is that as we loop through each one of these objects, we're going to construct each one of those items and add them to the page. Making the fetch request, I'll update the content of output text content, and we'll set that to loading. So right now it's just loading until we're ready to update and clear out the content. And updating it, so this will clear the inner HTML of the element. So once we get the data, it's ready to add to the page, we can clear out the content. So within the make list item, we're passing through the element information as item. And the structure is going to be within this object structure where we've got the name, the status, and guests. So let's, as we construct these, let's set up a few elements. So we're going to have a main div container, and this is going to be using the document create elements, so creating an element on the fly. So this right now is just going to be a blank div. And then within this div, let's go ahead and add the inner HTML for the div and set that up to be using the template literal. So those are the backticks to the left of the 1 key on your keyboard. So as we loop through, we've got the item information and item name. And what we also need to do is we need to take output and append the newly created div element that we created. So that will list out all of the names on the screen. So we see it there on the right hand side. So we've got the 4 names, and that's consistent with what we have within the JSON file. And the nice thing about JSON is it's fully dynamic. So if you make any updates to the list, you're going to see that that also updates to the JavaScript. So it's just taking the data and the JSON data and constructing the visual for the user with that. So we can also add in number, guests, and let's add in the guest value here. So item, and this one object was property name was guests, and I believe it was actually plural guests. So you have to also be careful that you get the property name correctly. So we've got the number of guests, and actually I'll remove out the word guests, so we just have the number there. And then also, depending on if whatever this Boolean value is for status, we can update and add in a class to it. So let's create the class within the style of the page. And give it a property name of active. And we can set the background color to red for now. And of course, we can update this as needed. So as we loop through the list, take the div class list and add the class of active. So that will turn them all red. And we can also have a condition here that checks the item status. And depending on what the item status is, it will either set it to active or it won't add anything in. So now only the 2 items that we have with the Boolean value of true are going to be red. If we update the data, that will now turn whatever other one that we have to red. Let's also do the text decoration, and I'll set that to underline. And I'll set the color to be red. So that way it's turning them red if they're, actually that should be if it's, and if it's not active, or maybe this should actually be confirmed. So let's change the class name to confirmed, not confirmed. And if they're not confirmed, then they're going to be having a color of red. So now all you have to do is update the JSON data, and it's going to update the content that's being output to the user accordingly. So just set this to div class list, and we're going to add the other one, so the not confirmed. So the ones that have been confirmed are going to be green. The ones that have not been confirmed are going to be red. So coming up next, we're going to make the list and make it interactive so that we can toggle the classes, and also that we can save the JSON data we can add to the list, and we can save the JSON data dynamically into the local storage of the web browser. So that's all still to come in the upcoming lesson. So go ahead and create your own version of the list, and also make sure you get an opportunity to practice constructing the JSON content, and then make some updates to the JSON content and see how it responds within the list on the screen within the web browser. Before the next lesson, set up a JSON file with data using fetch connect to the JSON data, and then output that data onto your web page with JavaScript. So once you've made a connection to your JSON file, parse through it and output it onto the page, create the elements and the page elements dynamically with JavaScript and using the source data from the JSON file. And you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to make this interactive.